Thank you. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be here. I do want to, though, start with an apology and a confession. The apology is that in about 30 minutes, I've got 60 very nervous people coming together to do a final exam. And so right after I'm done here, taking questions and discussing with you, I have to run off. I hate to drop out of this at that point, but I have to go there for answering questions. I also apologize for not being here yesterday, but those same 60 people were beating down the door, wondering about last-minute concepts and so forth, so I couldn't be here yesterday either. So I do apologize for dropping in and dropping out, but I do very much appreciate the chance to be here for when I can right now. The confession is when Vic called me up, I didn't immediately jump at the opportunity. And the reason for that is I always like to think about, well, what do I have to say about what they want me to talk about? And I haven't been so close to forest policy over the last 5 years or so. I've been doing a lot more work abroad in Africa on livelihoods and on economics of biofuels and chronic wasting disease and stuff like that. So I haven't been that close to policy and domestic forest policy in Canada as I have through the rest of my career. But when I started thinking about it more, one of the common threads that I'm dealing with across all of these things and things I've been dealing with for quite a while is risk and uncertainty. And so I thought, oh, this was a good chance for me to try to take some of those concepts that we've been using in adaptation to climate change in African villages, concepts we've been using about uncertainties of developing biofuel industries, and to take those types of tools and bring it home to some of the things that's near and dear to me, forest policy. And so this is something of a homecoming for me, and I really enjoy looking out in the crowd and seeing a lot of familiar faces. And hopefully some of these broader experiences I can bring back to my home and share with you some of the ideas that might resonate. So this is what I want to do real quickly. You had a whole lot about what we were facing yesterday, so I'm going to very briefly talk about that. I want to then take it into the forest policy context and think about policies that influence what we are doing now and some of the challenges associated with that. I then want to think about potential policies to address the challenges and then make some conclusions. So what are we facing? Again, I think you had armfuls of this yesterday, right? Lots of threats from different climate change. But what I imagine came out of yesterday's discussion, you can correct me if I'm wrong, are basically three big themes. One of them is the rapidity of the change that we're facing right now. We have a lot of inertia built into ecosystems and weather and climate and so forth, but that inertia is being overcome rapidly by changes that are happening. Changes that are so rapid that they are quite frightening to a number of us and what we're expecting them to do. The second is the scope. These changes are hitting us across complex ecosystems, influencing so many different things simultaneously that they become overwhelming in that way. And the last thing is that because of those two things, we're facing massive uncertainty. Uncertainty that some of us are feeling is unprecedented. That's kind of hard to say. But I think a lot of us are quite concerned, if not scared, about the massive uncertainty that we're facing with respect to all of this. One of the things I do want to point out, though, is that we would be mistaken, I think, just to concentrate on climate change. This is a lesson that I learned in doing adaptation to climate change in developing countries. We do a lot of work with people who are trying to eke out a living in these circumstances, and we actually do quite a bit of surveying of these people and try to find out, well, what is it that's really driving what you're doing with respect to adaptation? And climate change is just one of a number of different things, and for a number of people, it's not even the most important thing. So to forget about everything else in the context of climate change, I think, is a mistake. And so I want to remind you very quickly of some other things that we have to keep in mind contributing to this uncertainty. It's not just climate change uncertainty. There's all types of uncertainty that we have to think of simultaneously. Flat or declining markets. We're all aware of the problems we're having in pulp right now because of the technological change in media and so forth. I mean, personally, I don't quite understand why people would use media that they can't start a fire with, but I'm a minority in that respect. I like my media on paper, and those iPads cost a lot to keep on replacing. So markets are changing. We're transitioning from old growth to plantations. The rest of the world is already there. Canada is not, and we are not necessarily situated in the best position to be able to be competing with respect to plantations. And so that's a big thing that we need to keep thinking about. Changing multiple forest values. Again, Canada lags a bit behind a number of other developed countries that we see in this respect. It wasn't so long ago that the United States was also harvesting a fair amount of public timber. And their public timber harvests have gone down incredibly because of things like spotted owls, because of below-cost timber sales. And I'll just remind you that when we look at the value of our resources in Canada, we're not dealing in most cases with horribly valuable resources. We're dealing with trees that are rather small, that exist a long way away from mills, and these other values are likely to be coming in and overcoming some of those timber values that we're looking at an increasing pace. Unless technology picks it up and does something else with it, like biofuels. So we're not dealing with horribly valuable natural resources in terms of its fiber to begin with. And as I was just implying, there's all types of new industrial uses which are coming on the scene. So fortunately, some of the approaches that we can think about for managing climate change are also some of the same approaches that can help us deal with uncertainty in general, with this whole myriad of different problems that we're going to be dealing with. And so when I talk today, some of the ideas I'm going to try to express will be with respect to not just climate change, although that will be the core, but some of these other things that we'll have to be dealing with as well. So if that's the landscape that I'm painting to you, if you buy into that, then the question is, well, what do we need? Well, in a very general sense, we need to be nimble and responsive, right? We have to be able to respond to these changes as they happen over time. And it means that we also have to think about new things, new approaches and options. But in contrast to this, if you think about what we've been doing in Canada, this is kind of this dichotomy that Vic introduced this morning. We've been trying to maintain forests as they are. That's part of what we are as foresters. We try to keep them going. We've been setting and holding to management approaches that have been around for very long periods of time. We run AACs out 200 years right now, twice the longest rotation and so forth. So we're trying to keep things the way they are, and we do things very much the way we have for a very long time. Now these approaches are rooted in lots of different things. They're part of the culture of forestry. They're part of the reasons why you and I were attracted here to begin with. But they're also rooted in current policy frameworks, which are related to forestry culture as well. And so what I'm going to be doing today is starting to address some of those things in current policy frameworks that could be keeping us from doing perhaps what we want to do. So what's our starting point? Well, the tenure frameworks that we are all well familiar with. And again, what these are basically are situations where we have private firms managing crown lands. We have variations in public versus private control as a way of thinking about this, right? There's different things that the crown is responsible for, different things that the private firms are responsible for. And because of that, we have split obligations and incentives. And I have in parentheses there, they're sometimes confused, and I'll be coming back to that. The other thing that's remarkable is that we've had really few substantive changes to the tenure framework over time. If you look at the agreements that were negotiated in 1950 when Alberta first got its FMAs, the basic structure is still there. Yeah, they've changed over time at the margin, but a lot of the main structures, the main concepts that we put in place back there are still there today. And because of that, there are numerous aspects of these forest tenures that restrict the flexibility that we have. And so that's what I'm going to be concentrating on today, a number of the features of these different types of forest policies that we have that restrict flexibility. And again, being nimble and responding to uncertainty is a crucial feature that we need in forest policy. So here's some of the challenges and that influence what we can do. First of all, the fact that we have private management and government controls. The situation is managers aren't the owners, and as a result of that, we have a lot of command and controls put in place. The government says you have to do this, and if you don't do this, this is what you're going to be doing, or this is what the consequence will be. The challenges of that are numerous. First off, this is not an obvious one, but it's one that we were thinking about actually over a decade ago. Because forest companies do not necessarily have rights to manage forests, they have obligations to manage forests, the amount of money that's being spent on research by private companies is much lower than most any other jurisdiction. Now, I tried to get an update to some of the expenditures on forestry research that Binkley and Forgax compiled in 1997, but I couldn't find another study which did this. Back in those days, you might recall, Clark Binkley was Dean of the School of Forestry. He was quite interesting in making a case for investments in forestry research. And he had some astounding numbers that looked at OECD countries, sizes of forestry sectors, sizes of governments, and noted how small the investment in forestry research was in Canada compared to other places. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why is that the case? Well, one of it is that because the private companies don't necessarily have incentives to do that because they're not the owners of the land. And it's not clear that the government is taking over that responsibility. Who is responsible for the research? That confusion that exists because of the split government-private control is one of the things that has been argued to not necessarily lead to as much research as we need. As a result of that, I was reminding Vic earlier today that back in the, I don't even remember when was this, Vic, in the early 90s or something like that, there was a Regeneration Forest Science Council panel, something like that, that the province struck. And we were supposed to investigate what's going on with regeneration standards in the province. And one of the things that shocked me, it didn't shock the silviculturists because they knew it all along, but it shocked me to find out the lack of information that we had that was dictating what happens to trees after we put them in the ground. The inability of us to be able to plan a future forest just based on a lack of information, a lack of this research, because the connection between silvicultural activities and future projections of desired future forests were just not known. Now this might have improved since then. I'd be happy to hear what people think about that. But I suspect that we're still way behind in terms of where we could be if we had better incentives for forestry research. And lastly, and perhaps equally as important, is because of these command and control systems, forest companies really have very little discretion about what they do. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we have in Alberta and how that's a step in the right direction. But for the most part across Canada, when people go to the field and they do silviculture, they're doing what they're told to do by government regulations. They do not have much discretion with respect to, well, if we did this, this would happen. If we did this, this would happen. Because the regs are telling us what we need to do in a command and control economy where we have these government and public, these public and private interests split. Vertical integration. Again, an inflexibility which is going to make it difficult for us to respond to changing conditions. Vertical integration is something which is created by basically two different parts of the tenure system we have. One of it is pertinency requirements. And again, some of these are changing over time, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But pertinency requirements are those things which say that if you're going to grow trees, you've got to process it too. Basically, forced vertical integration. There's also log export restrictions, which prevent logs from crossing provincial borders off of Crown land. And so that means that logs can't necessarily go where they perhaps would be dictated to by markets, and it means that logs are tied to a specific mill. Again, forced vertical integration and not a whole lot of flexibility. So what does that mean? Well, it means as things change on the landscape, as things change with respect to different conditions, and we see this, for example, with respect to fire and mountain pine beetle all the time, we have problems with respect to having logs go to where they should. They don't necessarily go. Whenever there's been times when we see tons of logging trucks go over from Alberta, BC, and then when I first saw that, to meet some of the fall down in the BC AAC, when I first saw that, I said, how can this be? How can logging trucks be going to BC? It's illegal. Well, they're coming off of private lands and Indian reservations and First Nations reservations. So public lands, we still can't do that. So there's some big restrictions in terms of having our logs go where they're perhaps needed in times of change. The other part of this is because we tie fiber to specific mills, that fiber is not necessarily available for alternative uses that come around. Maybe future conditions dictate that we shouldn't be growing trees that we're going to stick into pulp mills. Maybe future conditions will dictate that we should be growing fiber that we're going to stick into biofuels. Incidentally, I study that quite a bit and I'm not too convinced about that. But we don't know where technology is going. We don't know where it's going and what should happen. And to the extent that we're tied with respect to specific fibers and specific mills, we're not in a very good position to be able to do that. As a result of this, what we find as well is that the way we plan our forests is based on feeding the mill. Feeding the mill is the bottom line of the forest management plans virtually across Canada. There's a chunk of capital sitting there, hundreds of millions of dollars in many cases, and we got to feed that, and so management is dictated by feeding the mill. Seed zones. These are the policies that basically are in place to say that whenever we cut down trees, we got to replace those forests with things as similar as we can make them. So there are regulations in most provinces which say that the seed stock has to come within X kilometers of the forest that you're cutting down. So basically we're trying to replicate not just the types of trees, but the genetic seed stock associated with those trees as well. So what does this mean? Well, this actually hit me quite a while ago well, I'll talk about that later. It basically says that we can't use what are referred to frequently as exotics to adjust over time. And exotics are basically those species which are not within those seed zones. We can't take poplar species from Scandinavia and put them on those forests and so forth. Those are outside the seed zone. We can't respond with those. So in most cases, on most public lands, we are not able to adjust to those types of things, to think about, well, maybe future climates will dictate that we should have different types of species, to think about, well, maybe there's different things we can do to ameliorate different values of forests over time, like shrinking forestry footprints with higher yield species and so forth. Sustained yield planning. This was one I've been on my high horse for a long time. I kind of get tired of it sometimes, but it still is at the core of what we do. You can talk all you want about sustainable forest management, but what we do in most provinces in the country is we calculate AACs. That's the core of forest management planning. And when you calculate an AAC, what you're doing is you're concentrating on one output volume of timber. So what does that mean? Well, very little consideration for other types of values. And it also means, and in this case this is really important, very little consideration for events outside of forestry. This is one of the reasons I believe that climate change has been neglected so much, because it's a bigger event. It's something which is not within the forestry sector. It also means that we don't think necessarily about what might be happening in China whenever we develop forestry plans and so forth. We are very local in terms of our planning and what we're doing with respect to managing our forests. Deterministic planning, and this is one that I've actually been thinking quite a bit about lately. If you look at what we do when we do our forest management plans in Canada, basically we calculate AACs over very long periods. We have very little that we do with respect to uncertainty. I'll talk about more about this when I talk about the potential directions forward. But there's very little consideration for uncertainty that we do with this stuff. And we also look at planning horizons that most people would think are incredibly naive. 200 years of planning. Now, I'm not going to say that we shouldn't be necessarily doing that, but I do think that we spend too many resources looking too far out and not nearly enough resources looking at the first 25 years in terms of looking at uncertainty and other things to be much more effective in our planning. So, what are some of the things that we can do and think about in response to some of these problems, some of these inflexibilities that are going to make it difficult for us to respond? First of all, experiments. In Canada, what we do frequently is we change forest policy, and it changes for the entire province. There's very few examples that we have, at least on substantive policies. There's been some of these on community forests and so forth, but there's been very few smaller experiments where we can go and check out some possible alternatives to this on a small scale. Do some pilots on this before you roll it out for the whole province. So think about specific alternatives. Some of these might be involved with thinking more about, well, what types of controls should we put on different types of resources? Should we have more public control on some of those resources that have a lot of problems with private firms managing them, like biodiversity? Should we have more freedom with respect to some of those resources where private firms are very good at it, such as managing timber resources? Can we somehow tighten up more where we need to tighten up and loosen up more where we need to loosen up? And can we do that with experiments that would allow us to find out how well this might work? Alternative approaches to commands and controls. Again, most of what we do in terms of forestry in Canada is the government saying this is what you got to do, and if you don't do it, this is what's going to happen to you. What types of alternatives do we have with respect to things we can do? Years ago, Vic Adamovich and Merriam-Webber put out a paper which looked at, well, maybe we should think about tradable permits for disturbances on forest blocks. Maybe we can have a limited amount of disturbance allowed in a township or some region, and then we can have tradable permits that have to be bought and sold to limit that. Some interesting ideas are out there with respect to how that might work. Sharecropping with respect to different types of shares of resources where we don't trust private versus public control. Lots of ideas have been put out there None of them, to my knowledge, have been tested on a trial basis. And this is the one I was talking about earlier that I told you I would come back to. The alternative regeneration standards that Alberta put in place, I think a very interesting move and potentially in the right direction. I say potentially because since this has happened, I very much wanted to follow up and find out how it's been working, because there's a bunch of pitfalls that could potentially happen with this. And I'm not quite sure whether it's overcome some of those problems or not. But basically what these are doing is they're taking commands and controls and they're allowing more discretion to forestry firms. You don't necessarily have to follow the cookbook. If you can come up with a plan and sell it to the government, you'll have some discretion with much higher order objectives dictating what you're trying to do to go in different directions. Again, I'm not clear on exactly how much that's happened. I know that when BC rolled out a similar policy early on, at least, again, I haven't followed this up recently, but early on they found out that, you know what, it was too much of a hassle. Nobody was going beyond the cookbooks anyway because it just didn't work. They couldn't get the approval. They didn't have the information in a lot of cases because of those research problems. So some good ideas. How well they're working, I don't know. I'd be curious to know more about this. Vertical integration. Well, those responses are fairly straightforward. And there are some provinces that have started to do this. BC did this early on, and I think Alberta actually ended up eliminating appurtenancy requirements too. Darren, can you correct me on that? A few years ago?
Yeah, about 10 or so.
Yeah, so when I was just telling Darren earlier, anytime I think about how long ago it was, I add 5 years to my memory and I'm still short, right? So that's the point I'm at. But eliminating appurtenancy requirements is a pretty important thing. The problem is, though, that there's a lot of inertia in terms of the system that we put in place. So you can eliminate appurtenancy requirements, but when you do that, you've already built all the mills. They're all sitting there. They're attached to those fiber flows, and to change that over time is going to take a lot of time. There's a lot of fixed costs sitting there. There's a lot of inertia in the system associated with tying specific fibers to specific mills. And with all that capital sitting there, it's going to take a long time before you start to see more flexibility in terms of having logs not necessarily go to that mill, especially in the context of log export restrictions. This is a big thing in the news right now, not with respect to log export restrictions, but with respect to beer and oil and everything else. It's at the basis of the Constitution. And probably most people in the public don't realize that we have not been federalist with respect to log export restrictions ever. Our logs can't go to BC. We are not a trading nation. So in that case, one of the things to definitely think about is allowing freer log exports off of provincial lands. Seed zones. This is actually a term that I heard years ago. Ellen was thinking about putting together, Ellen MacDonald was thinking about putting together an Institute on Restoration Ecology. She was one of the people involved with that. And we were having discussions about why that's important, and this concept of designer forests came up, right? The fact that we're dealing with so much uncertainty that we need to think more about designing forests instead of just replacing them. Thinking about what we're going to need there, not just because of future climate change and so forth, but also because maybe what society needs and wants is going to change over time as well. Sustained yield. Again, basically what we still do, despite what you want to call it, is we have timber maximization subject to non-timber constraints. That's the way we set it up. And you can't truly practice sustainable forest management until you start having those other things as specific objectives. And what that means is you actually manage for and project their values over time. And they don't just constrain timber harvest, they're a joint objective with timber harvesting. We don't do that in our planning. We start with an AAC, we have deletions for these types of things, that's just AAC subject to other constraints. And so until we start planning with multiple objectives this way, we're going to be stuck in this place. So basically what it calls for is explicit non-timber values over time, and thinking again about events outside of forests. Instead of the deterministic planning I was talking about, what I think we need to think a whole lot more about is look at planning that is done in other places. Stochastic adaptive management is kind of a bunch of words that I just put together, but I'm going to tell you more about what I mean by that, okay? There's two basic concepts associated with it. One of them is that you do iterative planning, and we do that now, as I'll show you in just a minute. You iteratively rethink about where we are and where we should be and where we want to go. But the difference here is that what you want to do, I think increasingly, in an uncertain world is think of the values of options. Think about, if I go in this direction, I might get stuck, whereas if I go in this direction, I might have more options in the future. And again, I'll get back to that in just a second. But when I started preparing for this presentation, I was actually reminded that about a decade ago, and this one I looked up, so it is a decade ago, Tim Williamson was actually working on his PhD under me. And he had this quote. I went back to his thesis, and there's this quote that he said, which was dead on as far as I'm concerned. He's basically saying that what we need to do is not think about AAC as a center of a plan. Basically, we have to think about alternative paths, as AACs as being one component of different alternative paths that we go through as we do planning. So how does this work? Well, this is basically what we do now, okay? We have point 1, decision starting point 1, and we have different options that we think about. And if we go to the top, we're going to follow option 1, maybe poplar with maximum MAI, and we're going to do that, and we say, okay, well, if we do that decision, we're going to have that happening off into the future. And we calculate AACs, and if you want to, you can even calculate net present values and financials of that. Option 2, on the other hand, is based on conifer or something else. These are just examples. And if we go that way, we do conifer over time, and we calculate an AAC for the conifer. And we do that based on usually maximum AI rotations and so forth. And what we do in that case is we have sensitivity analysis that we do on unknown parameters. We do look at uncertainty in that case. We say, well, what if the regeneration doesn't come back the way we thought it was? What if there's a delay in regeneration? We play with all of those types of things in these forestry planning models. And then we do that, and then about 5 years later, we do it again. Right? So we do iteratively think about what's going on with this planning process. We have a different starting point, and we look forward again at those two different streams, and we make another decision. In contrast, though, what I'm talking about is a much more nuanced way of dealing with uncertainty. Basically, it's referred to as doing real options planning. And this is a type of model of planning that we do whenever we're dealing with, for example, the huge uncertainties associated with biomass and whether an economy is going to evolve or not. The different options that we're going to have in the future, if we go in this direction or not. What type of technology is actually going to come out? And so the big difference here is when you're standing at decision starting point 1, you're not just thinking about whether you're going to go for management option 1 or management option 2, but if you go to management option 1, then you can also go to management option 1 and management option 2. And if you go to management option 2, you can go up to management option 1. And you calculate the costs and the benefits associated with all of these different paths over time. You think about each of these streams as being ones that you can jump back and forth between. And this is just 2 streams. Frequently you're doing this with lots of streams. And so trying to think about what the benefits and costs are of jumping back and forth across multiple streams is the nature and the essence of thinking about different options over time. It's the essence of thinking about flexibility. Now, this is a really different way of thinking about planning. You're not just thinking about some sensitivity analysis with specific values. Basically, what you're thinking about is trying to optimize where to go now so that I'm in a better position to start in the next period than I would be otherwise. This is optimization exercises. It also means that you're paying enormous attention to probabilistic outcomes of future states. One of the things we do in this type of modeling is we dissect price series through and through. We're trying to find out historically what's going on with price series. Are there trends? Are there volatilities? Are there volatilities which are constantly coming across between different markets? Are those volatilities staggered in time, or are they jumping up from nowhere? Do we have mean reversion happening? Trends that are coming back to a mean frequently, or is it Brownian motion, types of things which are somewhat random? And I can tell you that running through those same types of future scenarios, being explicit about that uncertainty and risk, is incredibly revealing about what you should do now, what types of decisions you want to make right now. So this is about real options modeling. And just like before, you start out at decision point 1, and then you reiterate. But when you reiterate, you're reiterating the exact same complexity as you did the first stage. You're thinking from where we are now, so use stats types people, you're thinking about Bayesian updates, and you're sitting at a new point in time, and you're thinking, and again, not just about should I go to A or should I go to B, but should I go to A and then to B and then to A, or A to B to C, or all those different options, and when should I do it? When in time should I make those choices? So that's real options planning, and it's something which we can't afford not to do the more we think about an uncertain future. Now, incidentally, one of the things that we're discovering, especially with respect to the biofuel stuff, which I think has some big lessons for forestry, one of the things we're looking at in biofuels is what types of feedstocks will be the source potentially for an emerging industry in future scenarios. And forests are one of those, right? Not just residues, but actually dedicated energy crops, which, interestingly enough, if you grow poplar at 20-year rotations instead of doing them by coppice, they actually are much more financially viable. So if you're thinking about dedicated energy crops and thinking about woody biomass, you're thinking about single stem longer rotations, not coppicing. Now, those things have a pretty good chance in a stable world. But if you start thinking about an unstable world like this, and you start thinking about all the future uncertainty, the Brownian motion potentials, the absence of mean reversion, those types of long-term crops start to suffer horribly. They cannot compete. You start switching over to things like switchgrass. You start doing things that are not, that you don't even plant biofuels because you're growing canola instead, and those types of things. So forestry suffers drastically in a world where you have that type of uncertainty and that much change going on. The long-term steady nature that we need to justify forestry in a financial sense disappears very rapidly compared to other alternatives in that kind of a future. And that's a sobering thought. That's something that we should really think about quite a bit whenever we think about this uncertainty. So, a few conclusions. We're sitting in a situation where we come off a very long and stable history. Canada's forest policy does not change that much. And as Vic was implying before, there's good reasons for that, right? There's a lot of good reasons to have stable policies. There is a lot of stability and knowledge from the wisdom of the ages. I very much believe in that. Moreover, we're messing with Mother Nature, right? We're messing with the crop, which we should be very risk averse with. We're messing with something which has evolved for eons, and now we're thinking about designer forests. We should do that with a lot of trepidation, right? We should think about what we're changing. And as Vic was also implying, an important part of this also is that you can't just willy-nilly change policy because that creates insecure investment environments. You have to be very careful about how and when you change policy to make sure that you're doing something that's good and not just messing up the political environment for investment in the province. But this is the bottom line. Not changing when a lot of you is, not changing much when everything around you is changing can be a bad strategy. You need to keep thinking about that. We need to keep thinking about that. And so what can we do with respect to some strategies for the change? Well, first off, we need to really clarify and keep in mind who is responsible for what. We can't point fingers back and forth and say, okay, industry needs to do this. Well, think about it. Why would they do this given the tenure system we have? They're going to have a hard time explaining to Weyerhaeuser Canada that they need to be doing this type of stuff, even though Weyerhaeuser US understands this very much because they have private land. But they don't have private land in Canada, so they have very different approaches which they take to their forest management in these two different jurisdictions. We need to invest more in knowledge. And the reason for this is because uncertainty is that thing which you have a very hard time responding to. Risk is more quantified uncertainty. We need to turn more uncertainty into risk, and knowledge can do that. The more we learn about these things, the better basis we have, the less we have to count on huge variations in terms of what we're believing might happen in the future. So reducing uncertainty through research, that's basically what research does if you think about it, is crucial. And unfortunately, as I just implied earlier, I don't think we're in a good position to do that. We don't have a system which encourages a lot of research in the sector. Again, I'd like to see some updated numbers on this. But historically, we have been pathetic in this regard. And I'd like to see us get a lot better with respect to this. Coming back to one of the points I made earlier, because of the importance of these things, because of the risk aversion which we should have, I very much believe we should have much more small trial changes to these types of things. I know there have been some of these, but we haven't done it on a very broad scope. We haven't thought about, well, let's give this a trial run in this particular jurisdiction. Now, part of the problem with this is that we have massive FMAs in Alberta. And so even just doing this on an FMA basis is not a small trial in a lot of cases. nonetheless, I think we could be creative and think about carving off little pieces of FMAs to have different policies run and do some small policy attempts. I also think that we should really think more about having a more diverse tenure landscape. We think about things like biodiversity and the importance of that. Well, I'm going to coin a term here, polydiversity. Okay? If you want to have some stability, some resilience in the context of what's going on here, I think it calls for a lot of different types of forest tenure as opposed to some basic big models that we have right now. So I would like to see more diversity, not just because of to make us more less vulnerable to the changes that are coming, but also because we have different pieces of land that should be trying to produce different things, and we don't do that very good under the current system. If we had policies more tailored to specific values that we were trying to create, I think we would do much better. And the last point, get lots of different people involved. There's a couple of things which I find worrisome that I hear time and time again. One of them is that policy is for policymakers. Well, yeah, it is. But you know what? There's a whole lot of other people who are interested in it too. And if you try to circle the wagons and make it just for policymakers, I think you're going to run into trouble. The closed circle of policymaking in Canada has got a long way to come, and I think it will be coming this way fast because it will be forced to start to involve more people. The other thing is part of this involving the stakeholders. One of the things that I harp on in some of my courses is to try to think about issues not just as being, okay, if we just know what the answer is, we'll know what to do. Because that research is going to help, but it's not going to solve everything. One of the things I refer to is chocolate and vanilla parts of issues, okay? Chocolate and vanilla parts of issues are those contexts whereby they're values that are not right or wrong. I like chocolate ice cream, you like vanilla ice cream. I'm not right and you're not wrong. They're just values. And there's a lot of those in issues. People don't necessarily all agree on the values underlying what we should be doing. So they're not necessarily going to rely on those issues, which is why it's important to get stakeholders in here. Because they're going to express the chocolate and vanilla to you, and you can't do anything about that. You can't change what they value. What you can change is the other parts of that issue, which have to do with knowledge and potential options to go forward. So that's basically what I was thinking about for the last couple of weeks. Any questions?